Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler. Now, America is a place that we in the tech ecosystem instinctively look to for a lot of things. Leadership on stuff, what they're building, trends, culture, energy, and how to think about the world generally. It's undeniable. But is that country, is America still a shining beacon? The optimism, the ambition, the dynamism we associate with it increasingly seems infused with something else, sometimes resembles something dystopian, maybe an atmosphere of guns, of extreme libertarianism, a general idea of being on your own. Now, I visited all 50 states and continue to spend a lot of time there, both professionally and personally. And there was a time when I thought I might actually move there and live the rest of my life. But I'm not so sure anymore. It's a complex picture, and I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast the co-founder of the AI startup Noan, Markham Nolan, who's also an alumnus of Storyful. And it's one of the most interesting careers, actually, of anyone in the Irish tech adjacent or tech ecosystem, including once having been vice president of media at the WWE and a director of editorial growth separately and engagement at CBS. Markham, you lived in the US for a while, didn't you? And where was that and how long did you spend there?
We lived a full decade in New York, and I think a lot of people would tell you that New York isn't America, but, went over there to work for a startup initially, went through some of the big American corporates, and we lived 7 years in Manhattan. And then post-COVID, we moved out to the suburbs. And my wife would often say, when we moved to Larchmont, which was a relatively nice suburb outside of New York, that's when it felt like we really moved to America. It was a little bit different. New York is an island of privilege and different attitudes off the coast of America, whereas Larchmont felt like we were kind of in America proper.
What kind of a suburb was that? What kind of a suburb is Larchmont?
Larchmont is about 25 minutes by train outside of Manhattan towards Connecticut, so over towards Boston, that direction. And it is very much like, Dunleary, where I am now. It's a nice suburb. It's, detached homes, picket fences, the kind of Wonder Years America that you see on TV.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because any town or city I go through, a lot of the towns and cities I go through now in America, because I visit a lot of small cities by choice, I'll say, and the small town, the centre will be hollowed out, but actually the suburbs are pristine. I mean, the facilities, the roads are better, the fences, the schools, the local malls. And so, yeah, I just wanted to get that idea of where you lived and how you lived. And so, as you say, Manhattan is this center for culture, for energy, technology, industry, finance, lots of things going on, the arts, entertainment. So you moved to Larchmont, and what was the thing you noticed when you were out there? How did things start to change for you?
I think it changed because we were in Manhattan. We were living that very condensed, nuclear city life where everything is walkable and public transport is just the way you live. We didn't own a car for the first 5 years we were there. And we were thrust into the suburbs where you're driving to everything. Everything is a bit more dispersed. And also people are more dispersed. You're not just kind of bumping into people. I think how you make your network and what defines which networks you end up in becomes quite different. And I think the odd thing about it was we lived in an area of Manhattan where we were kind of in a median zone. To our right, we had buildings with, high density of billionaires. And then 2 blocks away, you had public housing where we would openly see drug deals being done in the street. In the suburbs, the differences were, I think, more subtle and the wealth was more subtle. But the gaps between those groups felt even bigger in a way, that you were, that the groups were smaller and closed off. So it was lovely. And I tell you that one of the things that really struck me was everything was there in the suburbs. It was, everything ostensibly was available. There was the country clubs and there was every kind of facility you can imagine was there. But the barrier to entry was incredibly high because the suburbs is where the wealth really starts. And I think particularly in the radius around New York, between New York City and Connecticut, there are a lot of pockets of wealth and people want to live in the suburbs where the schools are really good in particular. A lot of couples with 2 kids, once you hit that threshold, people start to move out. And so what that does is it just drives up the costs in the area. and that drives up the condensation of wealth, the amount of wealthy people that are in an area, and that changes the
And I
dynamic.
mean, that's all fine. I mean, you might end up as one of those wealthy people. You might end up in living in that environment. It's quite pleasant. It's quite workable. You send your kids to the school. They generally get a good education. The facilities, the sports facilities those schools have are off the charts. They're better than our universities over here. There's an awful lot to be said from a point of view of, you know, setting yourself up in a really advantageous position in those places. What did you notice though? Because I remember when you moved back through various posts, and I remember you there was an edge to some of what you were saying. You felt, I think at the time, correct me if I'm wrong, that there was something going on in America with the culture that you found it hard to, that it was just nagging at you.
You know, there's a couple of things, and I think America definitely presents itself as still a shining city on a hill in a lot of ways. And, you know, kind of as I was alluding to there, the suburbs, you have everything at your doorstep. It is great, as long as you have access to it. And I think the couple of things, now that I'm home, and I think when we were having the discussions about coming home, aside from family, you know, pull factors to Ireland and a bunch of others, the areas of stress that exist, no matter where in the States you are, I think safety and health are two of the big things. We certainly noticed the vibe shift when you go back into Manhattan after COVID. The city felt different. People felt different about the city. Some of it was perception, some of it was reality.
How do you mean?
So I think we lived in an area in New York where I never felt unsafe in New York. I mean, we lived there for 7 years. I never felt unsafe walking the city, even late at night. It was, you know, New York had moved out of what it was like in the 80s and 90s and before, and had become this, I think, a much more sanitized space than it had been, and it felt good. And post-COVID, when you went back, particularly into areas like Midtown, so around the Empire State's building in the 30s to down to the teens in those streets.
Well, wasn't that Giuliani before he went nuts?
I mean, Giuliani was kind of an iron fist, and I think it was probably Bloomberg who made a lot of differences.
Oh, that's right. He was mayor of New York, yeah.
He was, and he was seen to be, right, he was a multi-billionaire, but a very efficient mayor in a lot of ways, and put a lot of his own money to work to improve the city. But COVID meant a big shift, and at the same time, marijuana was legalized. So you have this street level in New York where people hadn't returned to the office. A lot of the restaurants and businesses that supported the kind of lunchtime trade, they went out of business. So a lot of empty shops. And those doorways were inhabited by more homeless people who were forced out into the streets because of COVID. And the city at street level became a very, very different and strange place. And to those, you know, if you had grown up or if you'd spent time in the city the 10 years before, and it was palpable. I think there was a couple of very high profile attacks on subways and elsewhere in the city. And people are just more on edge, and you found yourself going around the city, looking over your shoulder, thinking about where you were standing on a subway platform, that little bit more than you ever had before.
Well, ultimately, you did move back. You're back in Ireland now, as you say, Dún Laoghaire. What was it? Why did you decide to come back ultimately?
A lot of the factors were pull factors around family. We wanted our kids to know their grandparents. It's hard to be in a city where you don't have family and support when you have young kids. And those are some of the factors. You know, one of the factors was I was starting a tech business. I was starting a startup, and I wasn't a 20-something who could afford to just live on people's couches. And the same went for my co-founder. I have 2 kids. We needed a safety net of not just family and network, but also knowing that if one of us got sick or something happened, that there was a system that would take care of us, which doesn't exist in the States. You give up your job and you give up the healthcare that goes with it. So there was an element of risk, and some of it was de-risking to come home and build a business where, you know, you have some of those innate supports of the state that just don't exist in the States. And a lot of it then was the quality of life. The quality of life here, particularly for our kids, is incredibly high.
In Ireland?
Yeah, a lot of factors. I mean, Larchmont is a seaside suburb and a beautiful place, but the vast majority of the seafront is inaccessible. The nearest public beach was 18 miles away, which you would have to pay onto. And the only beach you could have access to in Larchmont was a pay-to-access beach. You pay $1,800 for access to the beach for 4 months of the year, basically.
The Americans are hilarious. I mean, there's parts of America where you've got incredible public parks and the most beautiful places you'll ever see in your life. And then there's other parts where they just decide to wall the whole thing off, and what should be a public amenity, you end up having to pay. The East Coast is the worst for that, actually, but that would really annoy me. But talk to me about schools and guns. Wasn't that something that got your goat?
I think for any Irish person living in the States, the first time you get an email from the school saying your child has just done an active shooter drill, your heart kind of drops. It's a very bizarre thing, and you start reading up about what goes on when those drills happen, and the kids are told a kind of softened version of the truth of what they're practicing for, but they kind of know what it is, and they're aware of the culture. Both my kids went to schools, and lovely schools, like handful of schools. They were super high quality, but they did have to do active shooter drills, and it makes you think about, my daughter's class had a door directly out to the playground, but that playground had a gate directly out to a car park behind a shopping mall. And if you need to access a building quietly, discreetly, and quickly, that was the way in. So they were first in line. And I have to say that was just terrifying. The concept that the kids were training for that eventuality, which, wealth does not insulate you from in the States. The places that were being attacked, they range from, public schools in very rough areas to the most well-to-do suburbs where someone has had a mental health issue, they have access to a gun, they decide the school is the root cause, and they go and shoot it up. And, Sandy Hook was only about a 45-minute drive from where we lived in a very similar suburb. So that just sits with you.
And how did those active shooter drills sit with the kids? How did they react to them? Was this just like a normal day in school for them?
It was. They would train for what they call an emergency, and they would be told, in the class. I think we all know what the drills sound like. They have to be quiet. They have to huddle in a corner. A lot of school classrooms have tape marked out on the floor from the doors and windows just to show where the line of sight is if someone's looking in. So the kids are trying to huddle behind the tape. And in some places, they're given a lollipop to keep them quiet or a sharpened pencil. And they're told kind of the key thing is keep quiet, hide, and then it maybe run. And the last resort is to fight. And the reality is none of that's going to have any effect on someone with an AR-15 or an assault rifle.
Yeah, and this is just, they become normalized to this idea that, gun attacks might be a normal thing of life.
Well, I think, they absorb it from the culture. When Trump was elected, I had just started work for CBS News in New York. And as my daughter was growing up, even before she was 3, I would have the news on in the morning in the house because it was part of the job. And once she started to really understand what was going on in the news, she started asking questions about gun deaths and about the police's role in that. And, was it the police's job to shoot brown people? Because that's what she saw on the television. And that's like a terrible question to have to answer to someone who's 3 and 4 and explain to them that the people they know whose skin color are different to theirs, they might be at a greater risk. And that carried home with my daughter. When we moved back to Dún Laoghaire, she asked for a while, like, are we safe here? Are there bad people here? Or is anyone going to shoot us? And I think it took a solid 9 months for those questions and that lingering, just fear of what might happen outside the front door to dissipate. Mm-hmm. And now they know this is a safe space. They understand where we are and that Ireland in general is not like that.
So in your head, this was part of, a basket of reasons why you moved back. This was part of the rationale, was it?
Yeah, and I definitely. And it's been part of the rationale for friends of mine who have, made those decisions and are continue to think about it in the States as they look for roots home. You don't want your kids to have that. There's a lot of compelling reasons to stay in the States and be there. But that's definitely one that when you could be somewhere where that doesn't exist and it doesn't have to be part of your life, it weighs, much more heavily in that column than a lot of the other factors or things that are helping you make a decision.
The gas thing about guns, by the way, just as an aside, is that this constitutional right to bear them that they're always talking about, that's actually only been in place. I was staggered to learn this since 2008. It was a Supreme Court case called District of Columbia versus Heller, and it was based on a case that was taken on whether or not the city in Washington could insist that when you had a rifle at home that you had to have it unloaded at all times. And I think that was struck down as unconstitutional. And that was the first time that the actual right to bear arms in the US was upheld. And even still, I was in Arizona 2 weeks ago. I'm seeing guys walking around who are clearly packing,
Well, I think there's a lot of different rules state by state, and there was court cases in New York State in particular about this that were quite hard fought, because New York State, I think people's apprehension of it is that it's a blue state, whereas really outside of Manhattan, there's a lot of very red pockets, and if you go up even to Long Island, where there's still plenty of wealth, there's a lot of Trump lawn signs during election season. But the laws there were much more strict in terms of carrying a firearm outside the home. And you certainly weren't allowed to open carry or concealed carry, which are the rules around, can you walk around with a gun on your hip, or can you carry one concealed underneath your clothing? And that varies state to state. And I think there's constant lobbying back and forth between the groups who want to open it up more and make it less restrictive, and those who just don't want to see guns in their state.
Yeah, I had a fascinating conversation in this time last year in Alabama. I was at an IT conference, and I took a couple of days to go up to Montgomery, which I had never been before. And I stayed in F. Scott Fitzgerald's house because his wife Zelda was from Montgomery. Mm-hmm. And there was a curator at the house, and she was a fascinating woman. She was writing a biography of Zelda, and this was the Fitzgerald's house. So I stayed in Fitz's room, and his writing desk and everything was there. You can get an Airbnb, by the way, if you want to look it up in Montgomery. It's only $130. But the conversation I had with the curator, who was a woman in her early 40s, who was clearly very artsy type, and yet she was gun owner, and she was armed sometimes when she went out. And her rationale was that an armed society is a polite society. And it really reinforced to me that it's just an entirely different sensibility that they have over there to the one we have here.
It is. And when our kids were going on play dates in the suburbs, we would have to think to ourselves, do we need to have the conversation with these parents about, are there guns in your house? Which is not something you have to do here, thankfully. But there's plenty of people who think it's absolutely fine, and it's just, the just in case factor or the deterrent factor is a reason why they might have a gun. But it might not be because of the regulations. It's not going to be locked away in a gun safe. It might be in a nightstand or, in a cupboard beside a bed somewhere, that kind of thing. And a lot of the times when the gun is brought into school accidentally by a child, that's what it is. They see a handgun, they've seen them on TV, they put it into their bag because it was lying around or they'd opened a drawer they shouldn't have. But you have to factor that in. So across the board in the States, it is a big thing. And I don't want to harp on it too much because it's not the only factor.
I know. It was an interesting one that rarely gets discussed in an informed way, I think, in Irish media. Your former colleague, Mark Little, had a fascinating analysis on Brendan O'Connor's radio show recently. He was making a metaphorical comparison between the pre-Trump and post-Trump eras, like Trump 2 eras, as the sheriff and the outlaw. And his analysis was that America is now in the mood, it has swung back into a mood and being in favor of the outlaw. It sees itself as the outlaw and fighting back and rebelling against, this idea of a stifling liberal consensus. I thought it was a fascinating analogy he made.
I think it's a good one. I think that, Trump has positioned himself, despite being a billionaire and despite being someone who repeatedly has shown that he does not have the best interests of the working classes at heart, to be an outsider and to be the underdog and the outlaw. And that comes with a whole bunch of different cultural shifts in the country, I think. And one of them is, he's released this flood of January 6th convicts, people who attacked the Capitol in that kind of amazing scene. And the worst of the worst, the guys who were in charge of the Oath Keepers and some of the people who organized militias, armed militias, to go and be part of all of that. Doing that sends a message that this kind of ethos, the vigilantism that goes with it, is okay. And all of the stuff that he kind of tried to mask, this stand up and stand by, and that succinct messaging, which was subtle but also deniable in a kind of plausible deniability way, that's much more overt now. And the people who are being brought in are people who agree with that ethos, and it's okay to be belligerent, and we don't have to hide our belligerence or wrap it in polite politics anymore. Let's just say what we feel, and it doesn't really matter what other people think. And it's definitely a shift.
Do you know, when you were at the WWE, VP of Media there, you must have seen a lot of the edge of what we regard over here, rightly or wrongly, as being the sort of the Trump MAGA edge of society. Now, maybe I'm crudely stereotyping here, but I wonder, did you get a sort of an insight into that part of society, that part of America that votes for Trump, or am I completely off there?
I don't think it's necessarily fair to associate the thing that surprised me about the WWE was it was not what I thought. Like, I went to WrestleMania as part of my onboarding, expecting it to be very MAGA, very redneck, and wasn't the case at all. It was an incredibly diverse audience. Once you say you work there, the most phenomenal people come out of the woodwork to say that they're fans.
Well, listen, can I just put my hand up? I mean, I literally, as a kid, was it was the WWF then, that shows my age. But I went to, they came over here to Dublin a few times. I mean, I remember meeting Jake the Snake Roberts, hanging out with Davy Boy from the British Bulldogs, from the Islanders, Haku. So yeah, I'll reaffirm what you're saying there.
I had the CEO of an Irish bank ask me about The Undertaker and how he was doing, because they were a massive fan of it. But you couldn't avoid it. I think in Trump 1, there was a sense this will all be over soon and it'll never happen again. And that tempered it somewhat, because things like the Muslim ban were getting smacked down, and there was a disorganization in his government that time that meant, look, they're ineffective and it's chaotic, but it'll be done and he'll be relegated to Florida. And that obviously hasn't happened. And this time it's very different. I think that they have a plan. They're emboldened. They know exactly what the fight back was likely to look like. And in fact, the fight back hasn't really materialized. So this time is different. It's very, very different. And whatever you might have learned from Trump 1 kind of goes out the window.
I mean, bringing it back a little bit more to the tech ecosystem, we do have to acknowledge, don't we? And it's a point that Mark O'Connell made recently in a column, I think it was for The Guardian, that first of all, America still is the most dynamic single place for the tech ecosystem in general. The argument O'Connell was making, that there's an ambition and an optimism and a sense of can-do, and that's baked in to their cultural firmware in a way that's just very different to what we have over here in Europe. Maybe we lag a little bit behind. That's still the case, isn't it?
I think it's kind of undeniable, right? And the discourse right now around tech in particular is that EU and EU regulation is holding us back and we'll never be as competitive. And I don't think you can argue against that, right? We're much more heavily regulated. I think you can see it particularly in the AI space where we operate in with Noan. The AI Act comes into force in part on Sunday. That's going to bring about some pretty significant changes. And there's a lot more nerves. I was at an event last night where people were saying, look, I've chosen not to build my AI company here in Ireland. I built it in Singapore primarily because of the regulation that comes with being part of the EU.
Wow.
Full disclosure, Noan is a Delaware C Corp, or we're in the US. Have been talking about building here. And while living here and working here and paying taxes here is a good arrangement for us right now, we're still unsure about moving the company to Ireland because there's elements of the restrictions here that make it a little bit more difficult to do business and also less attractive to investors in the long run. But I think the long game for places like Ireland and Europe in general is that ultimately they're better places to live in a lot of ways. And one of the big reasons we came home, or a factor I should say, is look at healthcare, right? Look at what it is like to try and exist without healthcare in the US. It is so incredibly stressful. If you fall behind, get ill, that can bankrupt you, and that debt can stay with you for life and be a noose around your neck. That doesn't exist here. And I think I had a health scare about a year before leaving the States. I was lucky at the time to have insurance. I was in a job that gave me decent insurance. But the bill for my 3-day stay in hospital came to nearly $70,000.
Wow.
And
$70,000 for 3 days.
Yeah. And you're passed to look at some of the things like the quality of life and universal healthcare and start selling them as a competitive advantage. Like, this is an amazing thing to have. and it de-stresses and de-risks you, particularly if you're an older entrepreneur who are statistically more likely to be successful, by the way. They should be living somewhere where that stress doesn't exist, and there's less stress for their kids, and the schools might be better and easier to get into, and also where there's a consistent curriculum. Like there's a lot of those quality of life factors that we should be selling a lot harder internationally and pushing back against the narrative that EU is not a place to do business, because it is.
Yeah, there's 3 reasons why at this stage of my life, and I'm just over 50 now, why I would not go to the States. First is because I have a job here and a career here. And so there is an element of that, of just being in place. But the 2 other main reasons are 2 of the ones that you've just touched on. Health is a massive one, absolutely massive. But also lifestyle and time off. Like in the States, I have family who live in the States. By and large, they get either between 2 and 3.5 weeks. Okay. But that includes everything. Over here, my God, we get a lot of time off here, but I absolutely love it. It's not just the 3 or 4 weeks or 5 weeks that we get. It's also it's the bank holidays and everything else. And that, I mean, the European quality of life is, to your point, just fantastic.
Look, I think the Europeans have a better handle on the fact that life is for living.
I mean, it's worth earning less money, because I'm 100% sure I'll earn a minimum of twice as much. Gross.
Absolutely.
In the
like
States.
it is a sacrifice financially to leave the States. The market is huge. The opportunity is huge. The salaries are commensurately,
There's
much
nobody
bigger.
I know in my sort of age group, kind of rough social setting. There's nobody I know in the States who earns less than, $175,000, $200,000 a year up, and significantly up.
Yeah, that would be about right. And I think, but here's the thing: we came home here to Dublin. And on less money, we can afford to do more for our kids, and they can afford to do more. And they go down to see their grandfather in the West and hang out in the farm and walk the beaches for free. And we have a lot here that we take for granted that we don't realize is, I think, what makes life what it is in Ireland. It's a great place to live. It is a great place to raise kids and grow up. And that is something that, we market ourselves on the tourism and the TWE version of Ireland, but Ireland is a place to live and do your business, and it's a pathway to Europe, and it makes a lot of sense for a lot of people. Just
again, on the tech and the culture side of things, it feels like a lot of people in the Irish tech ecosystem, and every country's tech ecosystem, are visibly starting to buy into this slightly more in-your-face US culture, to do with business, cultural values. Do we think this is just a thing of defending value, shareholder value, that you're running with the flow, the same way as you might do with American syntax or work processes? This idea of being seen to be out there, to be either to be a Trump supporter or to be slagging off DEI. Do you think this is partially an actual just business thing, or is it just coming out of the closet?
I think there's an element to the coming out of the closet about it. I don't think it's necessarily just a mask people are putting on. I think if you read into where, like, let's be honest, right? Tech is a male-dominated space, and I think over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, there has been, like, it came to the fore during the Trump election, the emergence of the manosphere, the emergence of this male-dominated media culture that has given permission for these conversations to take place much more overtly. That comes from, like, this goes back, way back. I think there's a great book by an Irish academic called, I think her name's Angela Nagel, called Kill All Normies. And it goes right back into the influence of the internet on the culture and the discourse, and particularly how it's seeped into this male space and has affected the kind of broader mainstream culture. And I think it's been given the permission. It's the unlock that we've seen that came from the second Trump campaign. And people started to understand which way things were going. They began to understand that he was going to win, and this was the side to be on. And if you didn't express it, you might be left behind, or you might be out of the circle of trust. I could be totally wrong in that analysis about it, but
I think that's probably an accurate and a cautious, but I think you're probably spot on with that analysis. There's an additional point that Professor Scott Galloway makes. He has a theory, of course, that young men are meeting women less, they're having less sex, they're lonelier, they're increasingly antagonistic toward what they regard as a pluralistic society, and that this is creating almost not quite an incel culture, but something in the foothills of an incel culture, and that feeds this sense of anger and this sense of revenge and this sense of just, well, screw you.
I think that, he's very consistent on that, and he's been talking about that for a long time before it really seems to have crystallized. And I don't think he's wrong. I think there's definitely a male loneliness epidemic. I don't know how this attitude solves that. I don't think it's going to make it any easier for guys to find their mates, but perhaps I think it is. But it's all wrapped up in the same sort of thing, which is that struggle to deal with the changing of norms and accept that there needs to be equality in society, and that it may make it a little bit harder at times, because you're competing against a whole other 50% of the population that were locked out of things that you had access to in the past. It's a big challenge, and there's so many factors to get your head around. I think it's probably worth 3 or 4 podcasts on its own.
And we will definitely have you back, Markham, I think, for another podcast or 2, if you will, over the next few months or the next year. But for the moment, thank you so much for a really interesting discussion, and a very broad-based one based on living in the States and how that crosses over into the tech ecosystem. That's Markham Nolan, the co-founder of Noan. John Smith was on audio today, and JJ Clark produced this podcast. I'm Adrian Weckler, and you've been listening to or watching The Big Tech Show, and we'll talk to you soon.